back. Today we're going to be looking at antebellum culture once again, and specifically women's roles. So what becomes what we might say as stereotypical roles, women in the home, middle-class American values that we see for quite a long period of time in American culture actually were an effect of the market revolution. And many of them have just really in the last 30 years begun to change. So 4 concepts that we're going to address today: the public sphere versus the private sphere, what is really true womanhood, and then the idea of the cult of domesticity. So in the antebellum world, people began to speak about private spheres, and this comes out of the fact that for a very long time, work and home were essentially the same place. If I was a doctor, a blacksmith, a weaver in the era before the market revolution, I was doing that work out of my house or maybe in a workshop behind, but I didn't leave home to go to work. Once we see the evolution of the factory system, once we see urbanization, we begin to see work is a place beyond the home. You go to it every day. And therefore, we're splitting our world into what is known as a public sphere and a private sphere. And we're speaking about these concepts really in terms of middle class and elite people in the United States. So the male workspace is the public sphere, and the female space becomes the private sphere or the home. So essentially, women are left behind, if you will. And we begin looking at paid labor versus unpaid labor. So in the public sphere, men are going to work, they're going to vote, they represent the household in public in terms of civic groups, athletics, whatever it may be. Whereas women are going to begin to look at the home as their haven. It's the place where they will have influence, and also more power over their children, because women will begin to spend significantly more of their time with children versus men. So these are going to have all kinds of ramifications for the next really 150 years. So we are going to see again work leaving the home as an effect of the market revolution, and who remains behind, women and children, are going to have different functions and different status in American life relative to men. Really, the only area where we're going to see women outside of the home is in the area of reform. In particular, because the idea is that women have a better sense of how to protect the values of child rearing, how to take care of others. And those are values we're going to see in reform movements like temperance and abolition and the asylum movement. So those things become areas of women's expertise, but typically it's women through their church organization and with other women. You're not going to see much co-ed reform in this time period, really, except in the area of abolition, which was considered very much a fringe movement of the antebellum period. So what emerges for women culturally is this idea of true womanhood. So the value of men, if it is to work outside the home and bring home these wages to provide for the family, true womanhood becomes making that home a haven and reflecting what we're seeing as 4 cardinal values. So the first one was piety, that women were pious, they were connected to their church. Church values were instilled in their children's lives, and church was core to the family's structure. The second one is chastity. So the ideas, and some of these have lived on well into our own time, where women were not to engage in sexual behaviors before marriage, and once they were married, only with their husband. And that women could diminish one another, or men could diminish the quality of a woman based on her perceived lack of chastity. Purity is speaking about the idea of what one puts in the body. So women didn't drink, women didn't smoke. The true woman was clean. Her children were clean. Her house was clean. And so that's what we mean by purity. And then submissive to men. Obviously, legally, women were subordinate to men in the antebellum world. Women couldn't vote. Women couldn't participate on juries. In most cases, women couldn't actually be witnesses in a court of law. They were still living in most states under the idea of coverture, meaning that once married, They had no right to property. Their husbands did. They didn't even have legal right to their own children. And in the vast majority of states, women could not divorce, regardless of abuse or other problems that existed within the household structure on the part of the husband. So where do these values become propagated and sent out to the wider world? Through the media of the time. So we speak about mass media today. There was mass media in the antebellum period. It began with newspapers. And by the 1830s, we see the evolution of something called the magazine, which might be published weekly or monthly. And they were typically geared to a specific audience. They had subscribers and lots of advertising. For women, the most popular and the first women's magazine was something called Godey's Lady Book. And it will include many of the things that are still seen in predominantly female-focused publications. Recipes, ideas about home economics, getting stains out of clothing, time savers when it comes to cooking, or getting children ready for the day. That hasn't changed a great deal, except that in the time period of the antebellum era, these magazines were going to emphasize the idea of true womanhood and discourage the ideas of women working beyond the house or looking to have greater authority in their household relative to their husbands. And so in a sense, we see for about 150 years, media encouraging a stereotype, a middle-class, white Protestant stereotype of the successful family. The father is in the public sphere and goes to work. The mother is at home, and her focus is child rearing. And a woman who isn't focused on that has somehow fallen short of the true value of reaching this idea of true womanhood. Certainly, feminist scholars today see this as a cult of domesticity. And again, when you hear that word cult, we're thinking about a group in which someone becomes part of and cannot leave. There may be brainwashing. They don't have any autonomy or free will. And so feminists starting in the 1960s saw that all of this was sort of working together. You had the legal status that limited women for a long period of time. But then even as women got the right to vote, as women got greater law and control in terms of participating in things like juries and able to have access to their children and legally divorce even, that still there were these value systems in which if you did something other than motherhood, by the time you were in your mid-20s or early 30s, if you weren't home with your children and financially you could be, somehow you still had fallen short of what it meant to be a good mother and a good woman. Again, we're also in a time period where we're considering that women might be educated, but again, for the purposes of being better mothers and wives. So there were a few women's colleges that'll be developed in the 1830s, 1840s, places like Mount Holyoke and Swarthmore. But these are going to be places where you're studying art and history and languages. And again, no idea that you would ever go and become a professional. You're not becoming a lawyer, you're not becoming a doctor. You are simply essentially biding your time until such point that you get married and become a mother. Certainly the value system across America was that everyone should be literate. And so even young girls would have gone to primary school. But the idea that a young woman should be educated past about age 12, that was really only something for the very wealthy to embrace. So what we're going to see is this is a value system for middle-class people, Protestant people, white people. This is not going to be a value system for the poor, for the enslaved woman. These individuals are going to always have work, and there is no choice in that matter. Just looking at some images of the time period, certainly the one in the upper left-hand portion of the screen is from Godey's Lady Book, and this was to show the fashions. And you can see even by the clothing, middle and upper class women were not dressed for physical labor. You also see this idealized family situation in which the mother might be still providing some supervision and care of children, but the children are there to be enjoyed by the father at the end of the workday. And so things like discipline shouldn't have to occur in the father's presence because the mother has already done that while he has been in the public sphere. And then our last two images are to just concretize this idea that impoverished women have always had to work. Whether that's part of a greater family and needing to make that economic contribution for all, or in the case of these young ladies here on the left-hand side, they were workers at Lowell Mills in the 1840s. Farm girls who had left the farm because they had the opportunity for a few years to earn wages, much of that money going back to the family they left behind, a little bit that they would have kept for themselves, probably for the purposes of having a dowry, being able to provide some money into a marriage that their families couldn't directly provide for them. But for the most part, these young women had very little access to that money, whether that was by force or by choice. The view was that they were working for some other purpose, some greater good, not necessarily for their own financial independence. And then in our upper right-hand corner, this picture was taken just before the American Civil War, and we could see enslaved women working on a cotton plantation. And it's important to know that enslaved women had no right to their own children, no right to their own bodies. A slave woman could not legally have been raped, even if she was, because she was property. Most slave women after about 1820 would not have had direct access to their children past their formative years. In most cases, especially larger plantations, an enslaved woman who had a child would be lucky if she got to see that child with any regularity up to age 5. Typically, older enslaved women would raise these children, and in many cases, mothers were sold off once they gave birth to their children, so that there would not be that connection. And again, we will look at this idea of how do you maintain power and authority in a situation where you have millions of people who are subjugated in this condition of slavery. And one of those ways was by essentially destroying the family. So today we are just looking at the ideas of what the market revolution does in terms of informing and changing the culture. And we saw that a little bit with the literary and artistic movements in an earlier class. Today, we specifically wanted to look at gender roles and how men's roles and women's roles will become distinct, at least amongst middle class and elite people. Again, men in the public sphere, women in the private sphere. But also we want to consider that these roles, again, this cult of domesticity, the ideals of true womanhood, are ones in which you had to be middle class or upper class, you were white or Protestant. Impoverished Irish immigrants who were Catholic, enslaved women of color, poor white women would not have been part of this standard. They couldn't be. Because either they didn't have the freedom or they did not have the financial support for that kind of lifestyle.